All right, there's Zaman. And so Nando is the only one remaining. And what should happen is he'll just pop on. He'll pop onto the gallery panel. All right. Okay, here we go. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Myth Salon. My name is Dana White. Today marks another day in the epic journey of the pandemic through our culture. We seem to have leveled out. Hopefully, people will still behave themselves, even though many states are opening their places of congregation. But we have 550,000 people have died as a result in the past year of the coronavirus. And it really makes me extremely sad that there are still divisions in the culture about whether this is a legitimate issue for us to concern ourselves with, or whether we ought to wear masks, or whether we ought to travel or congregate. So as long as these medical and health issues become political, we're going to have a divided nation. And I would hope that at some point we can all get on with the same program and have a unified approach. So today we have Dr. Becca Tarnas with us, and I couldn't be more thrilled. It was her dad, Rick Tarnas, that first brought me to Pacifica to hear a lecture about an institute I really didn't know much about. 25 years later, I now teach in part of the mythological studies faculty. I do this. I've met people, formed a community. It's just become a fabulous journey, and it has transformed my life. And I'm deeply honored that Becca would come in today and join us. So I'd like to start off with a short moment of silence. And I'd like to read a short poem by Hafiz. I found it today. It reminds me of the work that I am currently involved in with my good friend, Jonathan Staggers, to interpret the 81 verses of the Tao Te Ching. We've now done 61 of them. 62 is in production. 63 has got the script being dealt. I'm going to wait for the screen to clear. The Tao Te Ching has become just an amazing project. Nando, would you mute yourself, please? This one is called The Lamp That Needs No Oil. I have made the journey into nothing. I have lit the lamp that needs no oil. I have cried great streams of emerald crystals on my scarred knees, begging love to never again let me hear from any world the sound of my own name, even from the voice of divine thought, or see that pen you gave me, God, in the sun's or sky's skillful hand, writing anything other than the word one. I have made the journey into nothing. I have become that flame that needs no fuel. Beloved, now what need is there to ever call for Hafiz? For if you did, I would just step out of you. So we have a great audience today. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to my very good friend and colleague, Dr. Will Lin, with whom I started this Myth Salon 4 years ago. Welcome, Will. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dana. I want to point out, by the way, I see we've gotten over 100, and so it means that some of y'all are getting sent to our brand new live viewers. So welcome to that. There's some cool chat features I hope y'all check out. I know AJ's over there, so we'll make sure we're keeping up with what's going on. I'm real excited about tonight. This has kind of been a long time coming for an event. When the Myth House began as actually a bunch of people living in a house studying myth, working on their PhDs in Ojai, the conversations often would drift towards Star Wars and towards Tolkien. And while Star Wars was very much recognized and discussed because of the whole Campbell connection at Pacifica and in the Myth program, I found Tolkien to kind of fall through the cracks, which is a little bit disappointing. I mean, we hear about Jung just plenty, but Tolkien is probably the greatest mythologist storyteller perhaps to ever live, but certainly in the last century. And I really believe in this connection between myth and storytelling, the study of myth for the purpose of storytelling. And that's what the Inklings were all about, studying epics, studying myths in order to tell more powerful stories. And that's kind of one of the biggest premises that I know many of you are following with why you even come to these events. And I think that there is no greater exemplar of the mythologist storyteller than J.R.R. Tolkien. And I know that many of us missed out on him in our graduate programs for those of us who went to Pacifica. So I think this is a really special, wonderful night. And I really can't wait to get into the nuances and details with an expert on the connections between Jung and Tolkien. I mean, and I'm just excited to go into Tolkien. The idea that we can actually bridge and converse and bring together these two really significant figures for our backgrounds, really tremendous. And so I'll quickly introduce our panel. And as I do, be patient with me because I really do believe that sharing the backgrounds on these wonderful participants is a big part of our event. So I hate to rush through it. Dana White, who is a scholar, author, host of this Myth Salon, and adjunct faculty member at Pacifica Graduate Institute. And I know you're familiar with much more. My name is Will Lin. I lightly moderate these Myth Salons, which I co-founded with Dana in 2016. And my PhD is in myth. 5 years ago, I founded a general education department at what's now Husson College, where we're committed to training our undergraduate filmmakers and performing artists in myth and storytelling. I call them all Inklings. Zaman is with us. Zaman Stanizai, professor of mythology and political science at Pacifica and Cal State, a poet, a linguist, a mystic, and a Fulbright scholar. He's written extensively on a wide range of topics from Indo-Iranian languages to identity politics, political philosophy, Sufi poetry, and esoteric Islamic thought. Boris Nunley is a professor of rhetoric, philosophy, and literature at UC Riverside, author of Keeping It Hush, The Barbershop, and African-American Hush Harbor Rhetoric. And he takes interest in issues of heretical energy, the dark feminine, gendered knowledge, racialized knowledge, and the demise of vulnerability. And it's a real pleasure to welcome Connie Zweig tonight, who helps us bring in such incredible guests. Connie is an internationally renowned psychologist and expert for her work on shadow, whose books include Meeting the Shadow and Romancing the Stone. I saw just a wonderful note referencing how James Hillman was referencing and recommending her work just in the last couple of weeks. Also, it's really just an absolute honor to welcome my friend Nando tonight. Hey, Nando, it's so good to see you. I don't know if I ever told you this, but, about 2, 3, 4 class sessions into the class that you were with me, and Nando was in my very first class for mythologists and storytellers, I started thinking to myself, is there going to be a mythologist this brilliant in every class? What am I going to do? But I can tell you, Nando stands alone and ended up running the Mythology and Story Club at the school. And that was actually when I was introduced for the first time to Becca's work. Nando brought it up and he was like, we need to reach out to Becca. And so it's real full circle to finally be able to invite him here with us tonight. And Nando, later on, I hope you'll show us your tattoo as well. It's also a real pleasure to welcome Chris Holmes. Chris is a musician and technologist, some might say a wizard, as you see, especially after his work with Disney on the Fantasia experience. After studying in Wendy Doniger's religious studies department at the University of Chicago, he went on to play keyboards for the Smashing Pumpkins before touring the world as a DJ for Radiohead, Daft Punk, and for 9 years so far with Sir Paul McCartney. A real pleasure to have you with us, and I hope everyone will stay tuned for some of the wild collaborations that we're putting on together. And lastly, it is absolutely wonderful to welcome you here with us tonight, Craig, who is not a ninja, but however, he is a poet, monk, mythologist with a PhD and an MFA. He teaches at the Maharishi University, which hosts the David Lynch MFA in screenwriting. And before that, he taught at Naropa, the Tibetan Buddhism school in this country, college in this country. And he taught with me at Husson College in the Joseph Campbell Writers Room. So Craig is also a founding member, which is just a really special thing to share, of the original Myth House that we lived in together with a big bunch of us. And so it's a really cool full circle. When I mentioned that we used to stray into conversations about Tolkien, what I mean is that Craig and I, with Mike and some of our other friends, used to get into those conversations. So I'm just real honored, and I'm really looking forward to an incredible, warm, fun night. So thank you, all of you panelists, for being with us. And thank you, Becca. Really looking forward to getting into this with you tonight. I hope you will take it away from here, and we'll join you in a little bit.
Thank you so much for the introductions, Will and Dana, for the invitation to be here. It's really an honor to be able to present this work to this extraordinary panel and also to this audience. So I'm going to share some images because this, after all, is a story about imagination. Mm-hmm. All right. The technicalities never want to work when you try to. One moment. My apologies. I usually run this very smoothly off of my desktop, and for some reason this time it is.
Becca, take your time. It's okay.
No PowerPoints in Middle Earth, huh?
I always try to avoid them. Okay, here we are. This ought to work for me now. Is that coming through clearly? Perfect. So as I can imagine, with all of you related to myth and Jungian studies, that you are somewhat familiar, at least visually, with Jung's Red Book. And Carl Jung's Red Book is filled with dialogue. They are conversations that are held between Jung and his soul. And in a passage near the beginning of the Red Book, the following exchange takes place between Jung and his soul. So he says, "I indignantly answered, 'Do you call light what we men call the worst darkness? Do you call day night?' To this my soul spoke a word that roused my anger. 'My light is not of this world.' I cried, 'I know of no other world.' The soul answered, 'Should it not exist because you know nothing of it?' So I ask, should this other world not exist because we know nothing of it? Or rather, should it not exist because the scientific materialist paradigm claims to know nothing of it? So this evening, for this panel presentation, I wish to speak about this other world through the lens of a synchronicity between 2 red books that were each crafted in the first half of the 20th century. So first, let me introduce you to Jung's Red Book. As I'm sure many of you know, in his late 30s, the depth psychologist Carl Jung began to have very profound visionary experiences, powerful fantasies. There were expressions of what he came to call active imagination. And he inscribed these visions in a large book written in black and red letters, accompanied by rich, gorgeous illustrations, bound by 2 covers of red leather, as you can see here. And he called this book Liber Novus, which means the new book, but it's better known simply as the Red Book. So now let me introduce J.R.R. Tolkien's Red Book of Westmarch. Tolkien set out to write a mythology, a body of legends, myths, and romantic tales that would be linked in a majestic whole. This mythology eventually took the form of The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and the many stories of the Silmarillion. But within the world of the mythology itself, these tales have been written out in a book that's been passed from generation to generation. And it's a large book, inscribed in black and red letters, accompanied by rich illustrations, and bound by 2 covers of red leather. Now, Tolkien presents himself simply as the translator of this work, and the book is known as the Red Book of Westmarch. So at first glance, the parallel names of Jung's and Tolkien's Red Books just seem to be an odd coincidence. The books couldn't actually share anything in common. When we look at their authors, on the one hand, we have Jung, one of the founders of depth psychology, an explorer of the unconscious, the archetypal realm, the phenomenon of synchronicity itself, a Swiss man born in 1875. And on the other hand, we have Tolkien, firmly English, a philologist and medievalist, eventually the famous author of The Lord of the Rings, and one of the founders of the genre of fantasy literature. He was a younger man born in 1892. So at first glance, there seems to be little common ground between the 2 men, let alone between their work. When I came to Jung's Red Book, I already had a strong background in Tolkien studies. I had been an avid explorer of Middle-earth since I was 9 years old. And when I first encountered Jung's Red Book, published in 2009, I felt like I was looking through a book from Tolkien's world. The style of the calligraphy, these ornamented letters, even the illustrations, they felt familiar. A certain resonance seemed to exist between these 2 bodies of work. It was as though there was a convergence of images, a synchronicity in Jung's terminology, a synchronicity of imagination. So the first parallel between the 2 Red Books, besides the title, was one of timing, which would be the case for a true synchronicity. Carl Jung began his Red Book period, so the time of his psychological descent when the fantasy images came to him in waking life, that began in 1913. And at the same time, J.R.R. Tolkien began making an unusual series of illustrations in a sketchbook he called the Book of Ishness. So virtually simultaneously, both men took an unusual turn in their lives. They turned away from the outer images, from the world of common day, and they focused instead upon the inner images of imagination. So Jung's Red Book period is considered to have spanned the years 1913 to 1930. You need a bit of a mind for dates to hold these timelines together. 1913 to 1930 for Jung's Red Book. but the primary content of his visions came to him from late 1913 through 1917. Now, most of the sketches in Tolkien's Book of Ishnis were done over a shorter period of time, from December 1911 through the summer of 1913. Tolkien made his earliest Ishnises, these first imaginal drawings. But Tolkien actually continued to add illustrations to the Book of Ishnis until 1928, so almost the exact same years as Jung's Red Book period. For Jung, 1913 to 1930, for Tolkien, late 1911 to 1928. So although the primary creative periods for both Jung and Tolkien were during these potent years of the 1910s, they each spent the next 4 decades developing the material they encountered during that time. And here's what Jung said of this period. He said, "The years when I was pursuing my inner images were the most important in my life. In them, everything essential was decided. It all began then. The later details are only supplements and clarifications of the material that burst forth from the unconscious and at first swamped me. It was the prima materia for a lifetime's work." That is Jung. So now returning to Tolkien, alongside the visionary drawings in the Book of Ishnis, another form of creativity was emerging through Tolkien as well: the arts of language. Tolkien was trying his hand at writing poetry and prose, not only in English, but in languages of his own invention, Elvish languages. Maingovannen Melanin, Ellen Sila Lumen Nomenti Elvo. Beautiful languages. And later in his life, Tolkien became a great linguist, and he was a philologist, which means love of language by profession. Tolkien's mother had instilled in him this love of language. She taught him Latin, German, and French at an early age. But Tolkien actually went on to learn a total of 19 languages, many of them no longer spoken, languages such as Gothic, Old Icelandic, and Anglo-Saxon, or Old English. His close friend, C.S. Lewis, who you might be familiar with from the Chronicles of Narnia and other extraordinary stories, he once said of Tolkien, he had been inside language. When he was a child, Tolkien began inventing his own languages. He called this lifelong passion his secret vice. And Tolkien wished to compose languages as others composed symphonies. The Lord of the Rings contains quotes and passages from 14 of Tolkien's invented languages, languages with such names as Sindarin, Quenya, Rohirric, and Westron. A profound relationship to dream, imagination, myth, and the world of images began both for Jung and for Tolkien in childhood. Jung was receiving dreams and visions from a remarkably young age, and the significance of these dreams and visions would occupy him for the rest of his life. And likewise, Tolkien could recall certain dreams haunting him for as long as he could remember. Tolkien described himself as a young man with too much imagination. Carl Jung, on the other hand, focused his life's work on mythic and religious imagery, the symbolic significance of dreams, and the archetypal patterning of the psyche and the collective unconscious. Meanwhile, Tolkien's narrative writings are rich with enchantment and symbolic meaning. Dreams and visions also play a central role in his Middle-earth stories, and many of them are precognitive and prophetic. One of the earliest visions that came both to Jung and Tolkien was of major significance to each of them. It was a vision of an overpowering flood. Tolkien sometimes called it the Great Wave. The first of Jung's flood visions came to him while on a train journey in October of 1913. So to quote Jung's words, he said, "It happened in October of the year 1913, as I was leaving alone for a journey, that during the day I was suddenly overcome in broad daylight by a vision. I saw a terrible flood that covered all the northern and low-lying lands between the North Sea and the Alps. It reached from England up to Russia, and from the coast of the North Sea right up to the Alps. I saw yellow waves, swimming rubble, and the death of countless thousands." Now, 2 weeks later, Jung was subjected to this vision again, and this time it was accompanied by a voice that was saying, "Look at it. It is completely real, and it will come to pass. You cannot doubt this." An uncannily similar vision came repeatedly to J.R.R. Tolkien in dreams and while awake. And Tolkien called it his Atlantis haunting. So in Tolkien's own words, he said, "This legend or myth or dim memory of some ancient history has always troubled me. In sleep, I had the dreadful dream of the ineluctable wave, either coming out of the quiet sea or coming in towering over the green inlands. It still occurs occasionally, though now exorcised by writing about it. It always ends by surrender, and I wake gasping out of deep water." Tolkien wrote of the great wave again and again throughout his life. In each telling, the wave destroys a great civilization. A vast abyss opens in the sea and swallows an inhabited island in all its glory. When World War I broke out in August 1914, Carl Jung recognized that his vision of the destructive flood was prophetic of the war. His interior images were reflective of the external political and cultural situation in Europe. So when the war broke out, Jung realized that he wasn't going mad, as he truly was afraid that he might be. Rather, his internal experience was mirroring the madness unfolding in the external world. Tolkien fought in that same war, and needless to say, the war had a tremendous effect upon Tolkien, particularly the Battle of the Somme, in which 2 of his closest friends were killed. And everything that Tolkien wrote after that point carries the mark of the Great War. After this flood vision, Jung began to engage with what he eventually came to call active imagination. In this practice, you hold in your awareness an image from a dream or a vision until you come into active relationship with it. And then you can dialogue with the figures that emerge. You can enter into the drama itself. Jung started to engage with active imagination in November of 1913, so just a few weeks after the flood visions. And he was calling to his soul each night and wandering in the desert of the imagination, unable yet to see with imaginal eyes. It wasn't until December 12th of 1913, about a month later, that he finally had a true breakthrough with the practice, and he entered into a fully immersive visionary experience. This vision was the first Jung inscribed in the Red Book itself, and it marks the beginning of what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. I'm going to share this in Jung's own words as it conveys the vision most fully. He said, "I was sitting at my desk once more, thinking over my fears. Then I let myself drop. Suddenly, it was as though the ground literally gave way beneath my feet, and I plunged down into dark depths. After a while, my eyes grew accustomed to the gloom, which was rather like a deep twilight. Before me was the entrance to a dark cave. in which stood a dwarf with a leathery skin, as if he were mummified. I squeezed past him through the narrow entrance and waded knee-deep through icy water to the other end of the cave where, on a projecting rock, I saw a glowing red crystal. I grasped the stone, lifted it, and discovered a hollow underneath. At first, I could make out nothing, but then I saw there was running water, a gigantic black scarab, and then a red newborn sun rising up out of the depths of the water. This vision, which continues on, contains many symbolic images. But for this particular study, I want to draw our attention to the numerous parallel images in J.R.R. Tolkien's works of the many underworld, underground journeys that take place in Middle-earth. The dark journey through the lost dwarf realm, Moria, where Gandalf is lost in a battle with shadow and flame. Frodo and Sam's fearful passage through the midnight tunnel of the monstrous spider Shelob, who resembles the giant black scarab Jung describes. Aragorn and the Grey Company's journey through the paths of the dead, where they encounter a host of the dead, a parallel to Jung's engagement with the host of the dead deeper into the Red Book. Bilbo's encounter with the dragon Smaug in the dark halls of Erebor, the Lonely Mountain, and Bilbo's fateful encounter with the twisted creature Gollum, whose lair is deep within a mountain cavern upon a little island rock set within the icy waters of a subterranean lake. Upon that rock, like the red crystal in Jung's vision, lay long hid the One Ring, the ring of power made by the Dark Lord Sauron. In both Red Books, the heart of the narrative begins here, upon this island rock, where a lost treasure of unknown power is hid, waiting for a new hand to grasp it. As Carl Jung was having these early fantasies, the young Tolkien was creating his visionary drawings in the Book of Ishnis. And two particularly stand out in correlation to Jung's underground vision. The first is titled simply Before, which you can see here. You can see the dark, oppressive entryway that pulls your gaze toward the mysterious red glow at the end of the passage. The particular shape of this imposing doorway appears again and again in Tolkien's later writings and artwork, usually accompanied by descriptions of foreboding, fear, and the unknown. It is a doorway underground, a doorway to the underworld. This second sketch was made directly after Before. You can see here a solitary figure walking out of a doorway of the same shape as in the previous drawing. This image is titled Afterwards, Before, Afterwards. And the coloring greatly contrasts the stark red and black of Before, but also conveys a sense of darkness and gloom. Yet I find this one somewhat less foreboding than the previous drawing. Now together, these two images appear to symbolize the crossing of a threshold, entering an underworld imaginal realm. Perhaps the most striking of the Ishnises is this one, titled End of the World. Here you can see a small figure stepping off a cliff by the sea. The sun is beaming brightly down onto the scene. White stars shimmer within the water itself. A crescent moon bends across the horizon. Yes, the image of a man stepping off a cliff and the title, End of the World, seem somber, even depressing. But perhaps they convey a dual meaning, that this is not only the end of the world, referring to its demise or the death of this man, but it's the end of the world, as in it's the end of the known world, He's reached the edge and he wants to carry on with his journey. And one could see end of the world as a symbol of the threshold Tolkien crossed at this time, the doorway to the imaginal, into what he called the realm of fairy. I also find that it resembles the Fool card in the tarot. Here are a few more images from Tolkien's Book of Ishnis to give you a fuller sense of his visions. This one is called Eeriness, where you can see someone who looks somewhat like a wizard carrying a staff walking down a long, lonely road. Here we can see one called Wickedness, which has the alchemical checkered patterned floor and a hand with 5 fingers and no thumb, eerily pulling back a curtain. Here we have Under 10-ishness. This one is paired with another image that I won't show you called grown-up-ishness. And it resembles both a butterfly and a forest. Here's yet another titled Beyond. And if you look very closely, that path leads to a doorway of the same shape as in before and afterwards. This image, Water, Wind, and Sand, is likely an early drawing of Tolkien's Great Wave Dream. And we can see how the figure in the image is surrounded by a cloud, see near the bottom there, as though he is both present and not present in the image, like a dreamer might be. So let's return to Jung's Red Book. There are many significant parallels between the style and content of the artwork created by Jung and Tolkien. The encounter with the dragon is repeated throughout both Red Books as well, both in the narrative and in quite a few of the illustrations, these 2 segmented dragons from both Red Books. These denizens of the deep are ambiguous creatures. They're symbols of good and evil, of power and wisdom. And even the composition is similar between these 2, as the red dragons spiral in the same direction. You can see in the left-hand one of Tolkien's the shining Arkenstone, whereas you have this radiant mandalic star in the right-hand one of Jung's. And both have, although hard to see, especially in Jung's, a figure, a shadowed figure, each bowing in reverence to the dragon. Both Red Books take place in a rich imaginal landscape. We are drawn into enchanted forests where we meet tree beings in Jung's and Ents in Tolkien's, and depictions of the world tree in varying forms. Or in Tolkien's case, 2 world trees. These are the 2 trees of Valinor. And in both Red Books, many of these trees emanate their own light. The 2 trees of Valinor, you can see the sun and moon on their branches. They bear celestial bodies, sun, moon, stars, in their branches. The left-hand one is Tolkien's own illustration of the cover for The Return of the King. And on the right, we have one of Jung's many illustrations in the Red Book. Sometimes the text in one Red Book will describe the content in the drawing from the other Red Book. So, for example, Jung writes, "I look. To the right, it is dark night. To the left, it is bright day. The rock separates day and night." Tolkien painted this image to accompany his Silmarillion cycles. Notice the moon in the image, crescent moon, but it bends away from the sun. That can only happen in an imaginal realm, where the moon doesn't take its light from the sun, but has its own crescent light. Now here we have 2 images that are designed with remarkable similarity, the composition. On the left is the first illuminated letter in Jung's Red Book, and on the right is the last drawing Tolkien ever made to illustrate his own Red Book. So both show a striated landscape, the lower third underwater, hills rising into the background, the sun's rays extending dramatically. In Jung's, there is a triple conjunction of the moon, Jupiter, and Saturn in the left corner, whereas in Tolkien's, the star Erendil, which represents Venus, glimmers faintly in the morning sky. Both of these images symbolize each man's cosmology, although in different ways. There are numerous other parallels between the two Red Books, many of which I won't be able to share here this evening. Jung and Tolkien each wrote cosmogonic myths, creation stories that they composed just 3 years apart in 1916 and 1919, respectively. The Seven Sermons to the Dead and the music of the Ainur, or the Ainulindale. They each wrote about the ending of the Third Age. They each encountered a host of the dead. There is the Green Man and the Ents, the presence of elves and dwarves and figures both men call gnomes. There's the post-heroic nature of the two works. There are numerous mandalas, symbols of the self archetype. And these first mandalas I will show you are Jung's. And these mandalas and emblems are Tolkien's, drawn late in his life. Of all the parallels between the two Red Books, a pair of images I found particularly striking were these. On the left is one of Tolkien's many illustrations of the evil eye of Sauron, and on the right is an illuminated letter from one of the pages of Jung's Red Book. One of the most profound areas in which Jung's and Tolkien's visions and respective worldviews overlap is around the nature of evil. They both had a deep understanding of the nature of evil. They could address its presence in the world, show the importance of confronting it on behalf of personal and collective transformation. Within The Lord of the Rings, the clearest view we are given of the Dark Lord is his great eye. And in Tolkien's words, it's an image of malice and hatred made visible, the eye of Sauron the Terrible that few could endure. Amazingly, Jung also has a description in the Red Book correlating to Tolkien's Eye of Sauron. So this is Jung in the Red Book. Nothing is more valuable to the evil one than his eye, since only through his eye can emptiness seize gleaming fullness. Because the emptiness lacks fullness, it craves fullness and its shining power, and it drinks it in by means of its eye, which is able to grasp the beauty and unsullied radiance of fullness. It sees the most beautiful and wants to devour it in order to spoil it. I would say that the single eye that symbolizes evil is an eye that only looks outward. It doesn't look inward. It doesn't self-reflect. The eye as symbol of evil cautions against the refusal to look deep into one's innermost self, to face the shadow within. Looking only outward, one becomes subsumed by that shadow, blind to it from within. And indeed, both Jung and Tolkien even use the same term shadow to refer to this darkness that must be confronted. Turning to another parallel, one of the most prominent individuals Carl Jung encountered in his fantasies was Philemon, an old man who provides guidance and wisdom and who teaches magic. Philemon bears an uncanny resemblance to another old man who also provides wisdom and guidance and is an embodiment of magic. Gandalf the Grey, the wandering wizard in Tolkien's Legendarium. Now, at one level, both Philemon and Gandalf can be seen as expressions of the wise old man archetype, identified by Jung as inherent to the human psyche. The wise old man is an integral part of myths and folktales throughout history. The wise old man is a classic motif of the hero's journey, aiding the hero when they have need of higher guidance. So while I want to acknowledge the primary archetype standing behind and also acting through Philemon and Gandalf, let's also explore the curious particularities these two individual imaginal persons share in common. Looking at their physical appearance, the scenarios we find them in, and the words of sage advice they each offer. So Philemon is described in Jung's Red Book as having a white beard and thin white hair and a wrinkled face, and there appears to be something about his face. His eyes are gray and old, and something in them is strange. One would like to say alive. Gandalf, on the other hand, is described as having a long white beard and bushy eyebrows that stuck out beyond the brim of his hat. Like Philemon, there is something alive about Gandalf's eyes. In his aged face, under great snowy brows, his dark eyes were set like coals that could leap suddenly into fire. We meet Gandalf for the first time in a garden, Bilbo Baggins' garden, at Bag End. This happens to be a somewhat disconcerting meeting for Bilbo. He greets Gandalf cheerily enough with an open-hearted "good morning," but when he soon learns that Gandalf is looking for someone to participate in an adventure, Bilbo's mood shifts. With masked politeness, Bilbo attempts to persuade Gandalf to leave. "Good morning," Bilbo says. "We don't want any adventures here, thank you." Gandalf, of course, responds, "What a lot of things you do use good morning for. Now you mean that you want to get rid of me and that it won't be good till I move off." Now let's turn to Philemon. We meet Philemon for the first time in a garden as well. In this case, it's Philemon's own garden. In The Hobbit, Gandalf comes to Bilbo in his garden. In Liber Novus, the figure of Jung comes to Philemon in his garden. The encounter is reversed, but the setting is the same. Both Gandalf and Philemon appear to be less than what they're first presented. Gandalf is seen as a mere conjurer who makes fireworks to entertain hobbits. Gandalf tells tall tales and sends quiet lads and lasses off on strange adventures. Meanwhile, Philemon is seen as a pensioned magician who has retired from service and who appears to be somewhat feeble-minded and perhaps doesn't remember the meaning of the spells he uses. The dialogue in this fantasy between Philemon and Jung and the dialogue in The Hobbit between Gandalf and Bilbo mirror each other not so much in content, but rather in feeling. Both Bilbo and the figure of Jung are quite disoriented by this first exchange and choose to bring it to a sudden close. So Bilbo declares, "Sorry, I don't want any adventures, thank you. Not today. Good morning." Likewise, the figure of Jung in the fantasy says to Philemon, "Thank you, Philemon. That is enough. I feel dizzy. Goodbye." Gandalf has many names in Tolkien's legendarium. Mithrandir among the elves, Tharkun to the dwarves. In the south, he is Incanus. In the north, he is Gandalf. Gandalf's original name in his youth, though, is Olorin, which comes from the Elvish Olor, which means dream. However, this word dream doesn't refer to typical human dreams, such as the dreams that come in sleep. The word Olor is derived from the Quenya or High Elvish word Olos, which means vision, fantasy. So Gandalf's name Olorin refers to visionary dreams, which is especially intriguing when considered in the context of Jung's relationship to Philemon and how this figure would come to Jung through visions and dreams. Gandalf and Philemon are both guides through the realm of images. What do the parallels of the Red Books intimate? To be clear, these are not the same books. We can learn as much from their many differences as their similarities. This is what I take of the synchronicity of the two Red Books. Both men seem to have entered a different realm, an other world. Tolkien called this realm Fairy. Sometimes he called it the perilous realm. Based upon evidence in his writings, it seems Tolkien was engaging with a similar method to Jung's practice of active imagination. and perhaps also had visionary experiences that he called Ferian dramas. Tolkien spoke of how his stories arose in his mind as given. He would say, I always had the sense of recording what was already there somewhere, not of inventing. The there somewhere to which he is referring is Feri, the imaginal realm. And Tolkien describes this realm as follows. The land of fairy story is wide and deep and high. In that land, a man may perhaps count himself fortunate to have wandered, but its very mystery and wealth would make dumb the traveler who would report. The fairy gold too often turns to withered leaves when it is brought away. All that I can ask is that you, knowing all these things, will receive my withered leaves, as a token at least that my hand once held a little of the gold. My hand once held a little of the gold. Jung made a similar statement, a statement that mirrors symbolically what Tolkien said. This is Jung. I felt that at some time or other I had passed through the valley of diamonds, but I could convince no one, not even myself when I looked at them more closely, that the specimens I had brought back were not mere pieces of gravel. The valley of diamonds, the gold of fairy, both men were describing a place they had seen, a place that could not be fully captured in language. How does the imagination, active imagination, give access to this realm? And in brief, I would posit that the imagination participates in the collective unconscious, giving rise to what some, such as Henri Corbin, have called the mundus imaginalis, or the imaginal realm. Again, what Tolkien called fairy. I would suggest that active imagination can be understood not simply as a means of accessing the unconscious in an objective sense, but rather as a form of participation in the collective unconscious. Active imagination can be understood as a form of participatory knowing. The fantasies that Jung encountered through active imagination can be seen as transpersonal participatory events, a co-creative enaction between the human organ of the imagination and the non-determined archetypal power of the collective unconscious. The faculty of the imagination participates in the archetypes of the collective unconscious, shedding light upon a realm that is simultaneously eternal and objectively real, yet is also newly created, emerging afresh with each new visitor to its domain. As Jung writes in the Red Book, to give birth to the ancient in a new time is creation. The task is to give birth to the old in a new time. The synchronicity of the two Red Books indicates that Jung and Tolkien were treading parallel paths through the imaginal realm. The doorway opened to each of them at the same moment in history. They were each given access to the same landscapes. They met many of the same people. Jung advised each person to make their own Red Book from the fantasies that arise through the practice of active imagination. Return to your Red Book like you would to a sanctuary or cathedral, he would say, for your soul is within its pages. Tolkien's Red Book is the Lord of the Rings. It's a text treated by many as a sacred text, returned to year after year, or read aloud with loved ones. Why is that? The Lord of the Rings, like Jung's Red Book, is an invitation to enter into the imaginal realm, to journey to the back of beyond. Thank you all so much for listening, and I would love to turn it over to the panel now. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. The panel, by the way, couldn't wait. I was getting messages through the whole thing, so I know there's a lot of stuff to talk about. That was so profound, and just, you know, two things that I've been wanting to know more about for a long time, and I cannot imagine a better introduction. I'm gonna like stumble over my first question, but there are several I hope we'll get to, and I know everybody has some thoughts. The one thing I really wanted to start with is you kind of ended with the land of fairy, and you began with the big wave, and well, not began, but close to the beginning. And so, when we interpret the wave literally, we see it as, a big, maybe World War I or World War II or something like this, right? But when we think about what water meant, especially to Jung as a, representative of the unconscious, and when we think about these two books as the foundations for both of them in a major way, and then we think about the role that the two of them had in awakening the imagination and the unconscious in our culture through mythopoesis, study of synchronicity and symbolism, I wonder if you think that maybe these waves they saw were just as much premonitions of the impact they would have on our collective imagination as prophecies of actual devastation.
Oh, that's such an interesting interpretation. I hadn't viewed it that way, but I really like seeing it that way as the effect rippling outward. I think one of the, if we take, Jung often describes water as a symbol of the unconscious, and that the idea of the unconscious is something that emerges in modernity. It's something that can really only emerge as the unconscious rather than as something that is conscious, as the imaginal realm, as our natural relationship to the archetypes, to the gods, the deities. It becomes the unconscious when it gets repressed. And so my sense is that that image of not just a wave, not just water, but a destructive wave is really a kind of return of the repressed expression as well. And we see that with the world wars, and also as an expression of that kind of upwelling of what has been repressed. And I think maybe that's part of what's coming forward in that symbolism too.
You pointed on fairy stories at one point, which I think we're going to share in the link down here. But in that, he talks about how fairy tales have been relegated to the nursery where they're rotting. Literally what you're saying, the imagination had been repressed. But like where we used to think these stories were for children, comic books and fairy tales, now they're like our biggest budget, most viewed stuff there is. And I am literally in his wave right now wearing a golf and ball shirt, living in his imagination. So thank you. I know there's some others that want to come in. I know there are lots of stuff waiting. So, and I don't see a mute off because everybody's being polite. But please, whoever wants to join us. Otherwise, I'm just going to straight point to Craig. Or Nando. Come on, Nando. Good to see you.
Well, first of all, thank you. This was amazing. This is an incredible, I don't know, it's beyond words. It's one of those things one of those parallels in history and literature that it's almost unbelievable, but it's there. I think I wanted us to go back to what you guys mentioned of the waters and this Ulmo, the Valar of the waters is often characterized as terrifying to both men and elves. And I find that fascinating. And also there is in the mythology of Tolkien a precedent of the flood, which is Numenor. And it's funny that it's the only thing that was, it's kind of a fall. It's kind of a Garden of Eden fall in a way, because the only thing that was restricted to the Numenorians' travel was the Undying Lands, which was west, the land of the Valar. And that's the one thing they tried to reveal. And this is when Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, Sauron, kind of infiltrates them. And I don't know, I just found that, I feel like I'm going to go on a whole other, but I just find that interesting that it's the waters that will cleanse this world that in a way was wicked. It's kind of also parallel to the flood, the biblical flood, which was a cleansing of this high civilization and its collapse and its rebuilding through Gondor and Arnor.
Wow, you're a deep Tolkienian, someone who references Ulmo and Anatar and Valinor. I don't get that a lot. That's such a the story of Numenor is where Tolkien eventually put that dream. He just kept writing it. And finally, like everything else he wrote, it made its way into the Middle-earth legendarium. Even when he tried to keep things separate, even when he tried to write about it in, say, the Notion Club papers or the Lost Road, it had to end up in the Middle-earth stories. And he finally gave it as a dream to Faramir. And that was the moment, actually, when he gave it to Faramir, that he stopped getting the repetitive dream.
That's very interesting. Wow.
Wow, that's really interesting. You know, Becca, for me, I saw these parallels as such an affirmation of the collective unconscious. And what came up for me as, you know, the shadow thinker, character, contemplator, is that there's in our culture, which is so ego-centered, ego-oriented, there's so much fear in moving into the unconscious. And the boundary between the unconscious, the shadow, the imaginal realm, whatever we call it, the psyche, that boundary can be very rigid, it can be very porous. I found when I was in clinical practice, there were times when the boundary kind of softened for people and they could be more exploratory. But most of the time, people are afraid of losing control and of sort of mental illness, and they're afraid of these characters. And even Jung in Memories, Dreams, you know, writes about losing control. And I remember seeing the film called Tolkien, you know, that it's a beautiful kind of biodoc about him. It doesn't have a lot of interiority, but it gives you a felt sense of him. And at least from that, he looks like he's living in his interior world. And he sort of doesn't even relate to his family, and he doesn't have much extroverted energy, and he doesn't spend much time other than with these imaginal realities. And I'm wondering if you want to say anything, you know, we have 100 people here, about this boundary between the the conscious and the unconscious, the ego and the shadow, whatever we call it, the persona and the imaginal, and how to encourage people to explore, to sort of allow the portal to open a bit.
I really love that question. And I think by just affirming the reality of these places, that's one thing that I recognized. You brought forward that these parallels really seem to affirm the reality of the collective unconscious. And something that I found myself seeking after was a different name. What happens if we stop calling it the unconscious? What if we give it an actual name? And so drawing on James Hillman and Henri Corbin and others, Mundus Imaginalis, the world of the imagination, felt so much more appealing because it affirms the reality of this realm, but also that it isn't just in darkness, it isn't just unconscious, that there is content there, that there is a whole world there. And in affirming the reality of this, I would also say that we don't want to overly idealize or romanticize it. Tolkien called fairy the perilous realm, and that it is a dangerous place to wander without a guide. I think there's a reason that Philemon and Gandalf showed up for both of them. We need that guide, whether it's an inner guide or an outer guide or both. And there were significant women in both Jung and Tolkien's lives who kept them coming back. For Tolkien, it was his wife, Edith Bratt, who in many ways carries a kind of anima role for him. And for Jung, it was Toni Wolff, who was with him through all of these experiences and whose role in the Red Book has been in many ways under-acknowledged. So in terms of the threshold, because it really is all about the threshold, and all the best fairy stories start off with the threshold. We lose our senses when we cross the threshold, whether it's Lucy Pevensey at the back of the wardrobe going into Narnia. She can't see anything. She just feels the fur coats becoming the prickles of the pine needles in the cold of the winter, or Harry Potter closing his eyes as he passes through platform 9 3/4. It is a threshold cross, and we do take a risk. But the more we affirm our capacity as human beings, that it's our birthright to travel back and forth between these realms, then I suppose we could say the safer it becomes, that there is this opportunity for consensus reality and mutual mapping of these places. And many, many people are, of course, doing that work, but being able to affirm it, I think can offer us a real gift.
Becca, I'd like to ask you a question on this, and well, keeping it on the imaginal realm, on the Mundus Imaginalis, and how we have these two figures. I was really surprised to hear. I'm a big Tolkien fan, by the way, in love with the books and all that. And when you mentioned that Tolkien, when he composed it, he said that he was not inventing it. He was actually accessing something that was already there, and that so resonates with Corbin's work with Mundus Imaginalis. That this is an environment that we step into. It's not something of our making, so to speak, though it is. But let's keep it contained. But the direction I want to go with this and ask you the question is how both of them are so enamored, that's the wrong word, but so involved with, say, the script. I'm not going to type this out. I'm going to actually write the actual script in this artful way. I'm going to find the images and create the images. It's almost like instead of traveling to Mundus Imaginalis, it's like bringing Mundus Imaginalis in and giving it a body, or creating a body to invite its arrival, so to speak, or to see if it'll come and fill that. And not just in the script and in the image, but also in the feel of the words, the sensuality of the language. I went ahead after reading Lord of the Rings and studied Old English for 5 years, Old Icelandic. I got into these sounds, the shapes of the sounds. And again, that's another kind of texture, I think, that maybe is a body, though subtle, like what Corbin would say, subtle matter, subtile matter, as he words it. I just wanted to hear what if you have some thoughts on that, on finding that cusp between where I leave off and where Mundus Imaginalis begins.
It is a huge question. And where one leaves off and where the Mundus Imaginalis begins, I touched on this in some rather convoluted language near the end of my presentation around participation and co-creation. And some of the ideas that I'm bringing forward there come out of participatory theory, which is actually a branch out of transpersonal spirituality. And having studied that, it helped me get a new lens on what might have been happening for Jung and Tolkien. And that it really does seem to be this kind of co-creative place, that it isn't just made up or coming from the individual. It also isn't just an archetypal channeling. There is this meeting in the middle world, the middle realm, Middle Earth, between our individual creative impulse and what is coming through us. And something that I find so striking about Tolkien is that he speaks again and again of how it's a process of discovery, it's not invention, that he's encountering the stories. And yet, if we go back and we read his early drafts, which we have the opportunity to read, this is someone who is such a perfectionist with language, with words, that he polished those visions perfectly so that they would make an experience that we could step into. But the other thing you find is that there are core images, core figures, core scenes that never go away, that are there right from 1911, 1912. The spider, that primeval spider, she was there from the first note he ever wrote about Middle-earth. So there are some who have clearly just been there from the beginning, and but he shaped how it was meant to come through. And he speaks about this in his theory of imagination, which is called subcreation, that it's in two parts, that the image comes through and then we shape it using art. And the result is what is called a subcreation, or a creation under God. But that's a whole set of kind of philosophizing around imagination there.
As an artist that's really into mythology, this was absolutely a fascinating lecture and was really inspiring. I've been going through a lot of similar journeys into that imagination myself over this quarantine, and it was really affirming to see the similarities between the imagery that I've been kind of capturing and these books. I wanted to ask you about the dragons and the alchemy, and if you saw a parallel with that. I know that there's a lot of theories that dragons kind of represent enlightenment, and that you have to pass through your kind of ego death to get there, and the gold that they're, it's the same as the alchemy led to gold. Can you talk about that a little bit? I'm just super curious about that, and I'm not an expert on it at all, but I just very interested about the connections between alchemy and the dragons and the serpents. And
I would love to say I'm an expert on dragons. That just sounds so cool. When I was working on my dissertation, I wrote some note down of like, get gnome citation. I was like, gosh, this is weird what I'm doing. Well, this is one of the interesting differences with Jung and Tolkien around the dragons, because while they each have these depictions of dragons, they're much more nuanced and complex in Jung. In Tolkien, they're always presented as evil. Now, even though they're presented as evil, they're also presented as very cunning, very wise, extremely interesting characters. If you talk to Smaug in The Hobbit, he has one of the most modern ways of speaking of any character in Tolkien other than Saruman, who has the most kind of political mind of anybody. And in Jung, we have much more of a complexity, and he orients, especially in the Red Book, toward the serpent more than the dragon. And so it's that ambiguity that I find more interesting, and I think is much more related to how we see the symbol of the serpent and the symbol of the dragon show up in alchemy, where we're talking about thresholds before. They really do seem to be kind of threshold figures, and that one can never quite know whether they fall on the line of good or evil. And so they are very ambiguous. I mean, I think that the imagery around the serpent and alchemy really comes down to, and this is just kind of one answer, we could probably talk about this for ages, but that the serpent sheds its skin, and that transmutation very much echoes the alchemical transmutation, that we really are being asked to psychologically shed our skin through that process. So that's one little answer. I feel like I've just kind of barely chipped away at something, and I know there are others who would be able to answer that in a much broader way than I would.
I'm very satisfied with your answer. Thanks.
I wanted to follow up with a question and just ask, because when I saw Jung, and they did that fabulous Red Book event in Santa Barbara, where they brought the Red Book, and some of us, I'm sure, here went. And when I saw the dragon, or the kind of more centipede-like character, I started making connections with "Thou shalt." I'm wondering if especially "Thou shalt," the dragon from Nietzsche's study, definitely feels like Smaug, right? I'm wondering if you see or have looked into "Thou shalt."
I haven't looked into it very much. Nietzsche definitely stands behind Jung's Red Book. Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Faust, Dante's Commedia. These are kind of I would say the triumvirate standing behind the Red Book. And of course, not all of those are cultural influences for Tolkien. Dante certainly is. Goethe and Nietzsche, not so much for Tolkien. And it's probably that Nietzschean difference that you can see some of the difference between Jung and Tolkien as well. But yeah, I don't have a sufficient answer there.
Oh no, thanks. No, that's really great. I just wanted to kind of go into that direction. Anyway, thank you. And I saw Zaman.
I would like to say I really enjoyed it, but I don't know, because there's been this constant knocking. There's been a calling. It's just like me, something, voice within me. And that is the voice of the person who created the term mundus imaginalis. That will be Shahabuddin Sohrawardi, 800 years before the two. And I think he is the third leg of the synchronicity. His book, The Red Intellect. Okay. Speaking of the synchronicity, The Red Intellect, and several of his other books are also pointing to the angelology that he referred to, which is the vibrations of the wings of the angel Gabriel. And he started this whole thing on angelology so much that because of it, he got in trouble. The difference was that World War II interrupted the thought of Tolkien and Jung, and the Crusades interrupted the life of Sohrawardi, to a point where his revolutionary thoughts were so much, in a way, they were way too much for the authorities to handle. So they got rid of him at the age of 38. But the words for the flood in the Arabic, the word for west is derived from where the sun sets. And the word set implies like it sits and it disappears and it vanishes and it's gone. So a place where things disappear. And perhaps from that, Sohrawardi takes the word na kuja abad, the place, the nowhere, the place where nothing is built or something like that. I mean, it comes back to that the concept of the mundus imaginalis, and I think that maybe with a little more delving into that area, there is a possibility that there would be the third leg of this this synchronicity, albeit separated by 800 years. But there is similar destruction, there is similar major war, and of course the Crusaders were as devastating for the Near East as the European War I or World War I as it's known. I think that might be something that could be explored. And so, yes, I did enjoy it tremendously, but I was kind of I was kind of forced to do my multitasking of going back and forth between the centuries to look for the similarities. And of course, since this happened just spontaneously, I can't get into the detail, but I think that they could be explored, and we could find out that there are a lot more than the things that I refer to. Even the very school that he establishes called the Illuminationism, and he is called Sheikh al-Ishraq, the Sheikh who established the Enlightenment in a way. So it's a philosophical, mystical tradition, but like I said, the unfortunate thing was that the poor man, remember, all of that was achieved before he even was 38 years old. So he died very young. I mean, he was killed very young. And the cause of his death is primarily that these ideas that he was exploding with these great thoughts and he couldn't hold them back. And the turbulent situation at the time was so bad that the authorities, well, couldn't handle one more situation where now they had the Crusaders here and the Mongols coming from the other side, and here comes this man with all these revolutionary ideas that some people thought that he was probably saying things that were quote unquote blasphemous in terms of the establishmentarian mentality of the time.
I feel like this is one of those moments where it's like my heart rate goes up at the excitement of encountering a whole new threshold of knowledge and, wanting to learn so much more about this Red Book and this individual. And two things that very much struck me in what you said. One was that that the word for the flood was that there's this going down in the West. Is that correct?
Yeah, where the sun sets, which probably comes in a way from the Egyptian mythology.
Mm-hmm.
The sun dies and then comes underground and is reborn again in the next day. And the school of illumination is somewhat similar to etymologically to the word Orientalism, where the sun rises. So there, this man rises, and his name is Shahab. Means the light. And so I don't think that anyone named his school of thought because of his first name, but the person's first name is Shahabuddin. And then of course his school gets the name of light because he was so preoccupied with the angels and with the lights.
That's really beautiful to hear. And one of the two parallels kind of jumped out. I have obviously a mind for parallels, and that the word that Tolkien brought forward for the island that sank under his great wave is Numenor. And not coming from numinous, which is what many people think, but from the Elvish word nume, which means going down in the West. So similar root. And then the other thing that stood out was
it also has the shape of a star. I think it's has a shape of a star that's close to the undying light, that light lens. I think that's
absolutely, yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think that was a really interesting parallel as well.
Definitely. And the other thing is you just mentioned that
another word for the word Numenor. Nor means light. I mean, totally coincidental, but
sure.
So and Num means name, and we were talking about his name, and light. So the light from his name is which is what we were discussing, and here comes probably a synchronistic occurrence of the discussion we are just having right here.
Absolutely. Well, the other thing that really stood out to me that you said was that he was killed at age 38, and that was the exact age that Jung was when his vision started. And so there's this kind of eerie feeling of right at that age, the work getting picked up 800 years later. Thank you so much for bringing that forward. I'm definitely looking forward to diving into further research.
Speaking of picking it up and being continued later, I just want everybody to know that part of the reason we made the live viewer on the website, which we're going to gradually start pointing towards more and more than Zoom, one of the reasons why is because all these wonderful conversations that we have disappear with every Zoom session. So what we'd like is for more and more of you to start making your comments on the website so that they stick with the video forever, so that as this particular connection grows and is discovered and explored more and more, maybe some of you want to get into it on your own, that would give us a place where we could actually continue to engage conversations like this over weeks, months, decades. So definitely just wanted to point that out for everybody.
By the way, I feel like I should mention that while I'm detailing these two parallels, because they're the ones that spoke to me, I've seen a number of other people pick up other parallels. Students I've worked with, for example, one drew forward some extraordinary parallels between Jung's Red Book and the visionary books of Hildegard von Bingen, the German medieval mystic. And so it definitely doesn't end here. And it really just seems to kind of continue to open a doorway into what some call the mundus imaginalis.
I wanted to bring a little bit, another question back to Tolkien. And I find it interesting that the undying lights, the undying lamps is where it's the West. It's also where the sun dies, but it's removed after the fall of Numenor. It was removed from the world into this kind of ethereal. There's only one gate that the elves know how to access to, and I keep hearing this word mundus imaginali, and I find it interesting that it seems like that's in Tolkien's mythology, within his whole mythology, he starts speaking at that. But then within that undying lands has a whole level of principalities that go all the way up to all this, people call them the Valar. Well, people assume them as gods, and in a way they are, of the god of the earth, the goddess of the stars. But then you have the void, where Ilúvatar, the god that created all these principalities with his thoughts, resides, and where he holds the secret of the flame imperishable. And it's also where Melkor, the first Dark Lord, got lost and found. And this is the part where people don't know where Ungoliant, the mother of all spiders, and I think Tolkien called it the unlight. She consumed the light of the trees that eventually burnt the sun and the moon. And I find it fascinating when you mentioned what was Jung's vision of evil?
Jung's vision of evil that's a huge question. I feel like there's actually people on this panel who would better be able to answer that than I would. I think that one thing both Jung and Tolkien seem to have in common, and I really do want to invite others on the panel to speak to this, but I think some will hold evil as just an absence of the good. And both Jung and Tolkien seem to, as Tolkien says in one of his poems, evil is, that it isn't just an absence, but is a force. But that is a question I would want to open up to everyone, if anyone wants to reflect on it.
I would also want to give a little context on also the principalities of evil within Tolkien's mythology, which is Ungoliant, this creature of darkness, the mother of spiders. And you have Melkor, who was the most powerful Valar and the most prideful, and he got lost in the void looking for the flame imperishable, and that's how he became evil in a way. And then you have Sauron, who's his lieutenant, who was the under the guy who created the dwarves, the smith, and he was Myron was his name, and he was prideful as well. But Sauron seems to encapsulate a more I would even say Christian ideas of sin. He's prideful. He's proudful. He wants to make his world his own. But I don't know. I just wanted to lay those out and see what comes from that.
Well, I definitely do feel like I can speak better to that in in Tolkien, just because I'm more thoroughly versed right down to his cosmogony, his creation myth. And he even seems to kind of put forward a contradiction that is there, as I said before, like evil is, and we don't know where this primeval spider comes from, that she seems to just emerge from the void, and was she always that way? So there's on the one hand this sense of evil kind of being there right from the beginning, but then on the other hand we have this complex story that's told that very much echoes a Luciferian fall, and that's more the story of Melkor, who then becomes the Dark Lord Morgoth. A lot of names in this, and Tolkien was a linguist after all. And I find myself in reading Tolkien's creation myth having a lot of compassion for Melkor, because his whole impulse is to create, to be able to create like in the image of being created. And I think this is something Tolkien himself struggled with. He even says, fantasy is and remains a human right because we are made. We are made in the image and likeness of a maker. But he shows in his story again and again what happens when one makes as a sub-creator under God, and one tries to subsume the role of God and to make from a place that isn't beneath that creator. And that's Melkor's story. And so when he tries to create, he brings forward, he weaves into the music at the beginning of creation this discord, and that discord creates ill harmony and clashing. And this is what we see in the world as evil and conflict and pain and suffering, and even the extremes of heat and cold. All of that extremity is brought in by Melkor's discord. And there's this moment in the creation myth where Ilúvatar, who's the one god, this is Tolkien's way of holding together the one and the many. He gets to have his pagan pantheon and his Christian one god at the same time. He's kind of living in both of those paradigms at the same time. And he shows to the Ainur, the many gods, what they have created. And he shames Melkor for what he's done. And I feel like that's, if you think of it like a parent and child, and the child wanting to create like the parent, Tolkien writes that of that shame comes secret anger. And then that secret anger leads to all of the evil that unfolds in the many stories that Tolkien writes. And so on the one hand, he is kind of presenting this view of good and evil that are very split, but then on the other hand, you have this fall where you can't help but feel maybe compassion for the creativity within us. The philosopher Alfred North Whitehead says that evil is creativity out of season. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about, that that it's misplaced, a misplaced creativity that isn't nurtured or is shamed, and then becomes the shadow and consumes us.
And I think it's also interesting that there is a precedent in Tolkien's mythology, which is the creation of the dwarves, which were not part of the plan of Ilúvatar, but a creation of the blacksmith, the smith Aule, who was kind of growing anxious of the coming of the children of Ilúvatar. And I think there is a precedent for that there in that kind of redemption, because I believe, if I remember correctly, Ilúvatar also spoke Aule for creating this, and kind of like lets them wake all the way to the end. And it's also Myron, who later becomes Sauron, who was part of Aule's house, was part of like the Maiar under the lead of Aule. And there's something about also shaping, about creation, about giving form to things, that it's also even reflected in some of the bad traits of the dwarves, which is they are really skillful, but they also become kind of like Feanor as well, in love with their own creations as opposed to something higher.
That's really interesting, Nando. I just wanted to point out too, that all these kind of diversities in the way that creation is being engaged, I think, and evil, I think it really reflects the fact that Tolkien was wrestling with it for a long time. And one of the things that comes up is that he never, when he was writing, he never really decided if he thought evil was redeemable or not, or if it was, in the way that he ends up finishing Lord of the Rings, there's such a thing as irredeemable evil, and thus it's all justified to kill the orcs and all that good stuff. But in his personal life, he really wrestled with whether or not evil was irredeemable, if there was any such thing as an irredeemable evil. And I think that kind of internal struggle, by the way, it's not the answers, it's not the questions that are easy to answer that we talk about for thousands of years. It's the ones that are being wrestled with like this. And I don't know. I just think it's really cool to see all the dynamism and the different ways he's trying to engage it. And I think it's an expression of his, ever ongoing relationship with that question.
Well, I'd like to just chime in one more time because I'm really inspired by the synchronicity that Zaman brought up and that you've brought up as well, Becca, which is when you're in the cosmogony and we're talking about the Ainur who sing the themes into being. And this is, I think this is parallel with Suravardi's 5 Hadarat, where we have the manifestations coming in through this hierarchy or through these different levels. And I think it's a really interesting similarity that the two share, that creation is coming through either through Tolkien as he imagined it, as it being sung in by these, possibly to look at these Ainur as the different the angelology, so to speak, of the Hadarat that we read about in, say, in Corbin's work, but even better as Zaman, as you pointed out, going back to the source with Suravardi himself. I think that's a really interesting synchronicity, and I just got a little excited about that parallel. So I just wanted to throw that out there because I think there may be something in there. And as you say, the mythology in there is, like Zaman mentioned, it's Egyptian or I mean, certainly with Jung's vision of the black scarab, right? And then to the resplendent sun, where we got the Nigredo and the Rubedo happening there, and the same colors happening with Tolkien. And that one image that you showed, which was the tree, I forget which tree it was, but it was the tree of Amalian was just the exact image of Splendor Solis in, I think it's either in the 3rd series or in the 1st series, that has trees, and the similarity in Tolkien's art on that tree and the art in that alchemical text is, well, as you say, synchronistic. But I'd say it's very synchronistic. So I just wanted to throw that out there because I think, yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. There's so many of both of their images could really echo a lot of alchemical imagery, and we could just follow these roots deeper and deeper for both of them. And I just want to repeat one of my favorite lines from Jung's Red Book, which I think really speaks to what we're talking about here, and the beautiful parallel that Zaman brought up as well, that Jung says, to give birth to the ancient in a new time is creation. The task is to give birth to the old in a new time. And it really does feel like through Jung and Tolkien, there is a rebirth of something that has been born many, many times before, in multiple forms, and yet carrying this archetypal essence, and sometimes even carrying the same name, such as the Red Book. There are many red books coming out of, whether it's coming out of China or so many different parts of the world, that we can trace these different threads. And that again, as Connie was saying, I mean, it just speaks to the collectivity of the collective unconscious.
You know, Becca, the thing that occurs to me in hearing your wonderful presentation and the allusions to water, which to me, when Campbell talks about the awe and tremendous, he's really talking about wholeness. And there's an apprehension that people, individual and even collectively, have about wholeness. So they create divinities to express that wholeness. But there is still a tremendous fear and respect for wholeness. And so when I look at the characters of the various stories in Tolkien, it seems to me there's an underwriting level of trust with the water and with the dream and with the things that connect them to whatever will convey them to that eternal world. Is that something that you could either address or respond to?
Would you mind saying just the last part of your question again? Sorry.
How do you think that the characters in the stories relate to the idea of wholeness or the omnipresent, eternal, whatever the condition of oneness is? Because I hear you talking about the, the collective unconscious. To me, that sounds like the Tao. It sounds like this is the condition from which everything emanates, and where we are is we're caught in our particularities, and out of those particularities, we come up with the characterizations that give the world in which we live meaning.
That's such a delicious question. It's, in a lot of ways, it seems to just come back to that perennial question of the relationship of the many and the one. And when we speak about unity, when we speak about the collective unconscious, for example, as this kind of unified field, even the title of one of Jung's books, The Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious. I mean, that is like the many in the one. And that these, when we look to Tolkien, these characters who emerge, we can see their archetypal source. We can see, often when I think about that relationship between like the archetypal and the divine unity, I like to just imagine like white light passing through a prism and refracting into many colors. And each of those colors is a different archetypal or a different archetype. And then within each of those bands of colored light is an infinity of spectrums, all the infinite shades of green, all the infinite shades of blue. And each one of those infinite expressions can become the particular, whether that particular is you or me or any individual. And I see figures like Jung encountered in his Red Book fantasies, or like Tolkien wrote about in The Lord of the Rings, or anyone else who is doing this co-creative work, as that they are enacting, that they are calling forward those archetypal particulars out of that unity. And so I really do like to try and walk that middle path where we fall neither into saying, oh, it's all one, or, oh, it's only archetypal reductionism, but also not just saying that's very specific and particular. When we allow ourselves to walk the pathways of Middle Earth and to encounter Frodo or Sam or Legolas or Gandalf or Aragorn or Arwen or any one of them, that we can see the archetypal shining through them, but we can also appreciate the particularity of who they are as individuals, even if they are imaginal individuals. That's why when I was talking about Philemon and Gandalf, I didn't want to just say, oh, it's the wise old man. We can see the wise old man behind those two, or behind Obi-Wan Kenobi, or behind Dumbledore, or behind Merlin. We know that he's there, and we know that that wise old man redounds to an even deeper archetypal principle, that Saturnian principle, for example. But I also want to get to know Gandalf just for Gandalf, with his pipe and his staff and his strange sense of humor and his sharp criticism and the recognition that he ultimately is the greatest fool of them all. And I want to get to know Philemon in that same way. So I hope that helps answer your question.
What a beautiful, beautiful response. I had one other thing that I heard when you were talking about the eye, which was, it reminded me of the evil eye that I encountered in Turkey. And it's just one eye, and it is designed to ward off or contain, the presence of what they consider the evil, which is actually the good dressed up slightly differently. And it comes to us as a kind of avatar of the healing spirits that we need, which is why they wear them around. I mean, they put them on jewelry and they put them on buildings and they do all kinds of stuff with it. And I think it's a beautiful symbol.
That's the amazing thing with symbols, is that they don't just mean one thing. And even that eye in Jung's Red Book, it looks just like Tolkien's. He does have this later description of the eye of the evil one, but that eye might be saying a lot of different things as it gazes out from that first letter of Liber Secundus. So I, just in the same way as I wouldn't want to kind of reduce everything down to an archetype, I also wouldn't want to reduce an archetype down to a single meaning.
Forgive me for being so selfishly kind of jumping in. I wanted to piggyback on what Dana was saying. And when he started his second question, I didn't realize it was actually going to lead into the same thing I wanted to ask about too, which is, do you see a relationship between Jung's notion of the death of the ego and the importance of that on that path towards wholeness and the destruction of the ring?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I do definitely see a very kind of interesting parallel there, in the sense that, we're long past spoiler alerts here, but in the pivotal moment when it comes time for Frodo to destroy the One Ring, he cannot do it. And that he, in that moment, turns toward evil, even when minutes before he hadn't yet. He's still able to fight off Gollum. And that what Frodo had down to the last moment was his goodness, was his humility, was his capacity to resist the temptation of the ring. And there are some Tolkien scholars who read this as Frodo is a failed hero. And as a failed hero, that perhaps we ought to kind of bring a certain criticism to him. It's the enemy, the soldier who's gone over to the enemy, for example. But I like to read it a little differently, that rather than saying he is a failed hero, he makes the ultimate sacrifice of the last thing he has left. And in that way, it is a death of the ego. It's a death of everything that made Frodo what he was. And it's in that ultimate sacrifice that Gollum is able to overcome him. And then chance, divine chance, steps in and the ring is destroyed. And so I don't see Frodo as a failed hero. I see him actually in a lot of ways as a parallel to, because he any more of a failed hero than Christ in Christ's moment on the cross, when he says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? It's the same complete surrender into the moment. And that is what allows what Tolkien calls the eucatastrophe, the unexpected joyous turn, to take place. And so, yes, absolutely. It's and in that same way, it is the death of the ego that allows the eucatastrophe to unfold in anyone's path of individuation.
Thank you. That's just perfect. And it, keynote. I think about how, one of my Jungian teachers, Walter O'Dynnick, used to say the hero is the ego in your dreams. And so in some ways, you think about that confrontation is ultimately Frodo had to go through that exact same thing. And then, you think about how the Ring of Gyges, the Ring of Invisibility from Plato's Republic, that is the conversation that we see in the Western canon as the conversation about egoism is the Ring of Invisibility. And so here he destroys the Ring of Invisibility, ego with it, and restores union, or at least a healthy state. Anyway, thanks for indulging me. I totally feel bad because when I talk too much, and I know Boris has got something he wanted to jump in with, and I wanted to see if I could invite you in, Boris, with your waters of the unconscious behind you.
Thank you for looking out for me, Will. I appreciate it. Becca, what I do want to say to you is, for me, I've always found that a person's brilliance is not in their presentation, but how they handle the Q&A, the resistances that come with Q&A, how one wrestles with it, and you've done just a wonderful job, just extraordinary. So I want to congratulate you on that.
Thank you.
Earlier, you did a wonderful job of articulating how in the Red Book, and connecting it to Tolkien, and the notion of Philemon, right? And how you could find a similar image of the old man in Tolkien's Red Book. Given the importance of Salome to Jung's Red Book, I'm wondering, is there a similar image in Tolkien's Red Book? Again, you did talk about some of the women involved in Jung's life and in Tolkien's life, but I'm wondering in terms of his Red Book, Tolkien's Red Book, is there a similar figure to Salome? And then another question I'd like you to address is how Tolkien deals with otherness. Because of my own lectures and work, I always bring up how Tolkien deals with diversity in a way that we could all learn from, where it's more than just about difference. If we're talking about the orcs, if we're talking about the dwarves, et cetera, how he always grounds this otherness and bringing different kind of knowledges to bear upon reality, which I think is really central to any kind of informed notion of diversity. So there's kind of like two questions there. One, again, about, is there a similar figure to Salome and Tolkien's Red Book? And then again, talk a little bit how you feel Tolkien addresses terms of otherness and diversity, because I think it just does a wonderful job from which we can learn from these days.
I love both of those questions. And your first question, actually, I did a rapid kind of editing of what I was going to present, because I realized that I would be speaking for probably another 10 minutes longer, and I wanted to make sure that we could open up to the dialogue. So absolutely, there is a parallel. Not only is there a parallel, she's kind of the most important figure. So it almost broke my heart to do this. But this figure who can be found in both Red Books, and Salome is one expression of her. Jung calls her his soul, and he thought that she was his soul, and he'd later come to call her the anima, but I really believe that she's more than that, and rather that we would say she is soul, just she is soul, not his soul. She cannot be possessed. And that this figure comes forward in Tolkien in multiple different forms, as Galadriel, as Elbereth Gilthoniel, and most importantly, as the Queen of Faerie. And so the part that I didn't present was sharing a passage from Tolkien's last short story. Last thing he ever wrote, 1967. It's Smith of Wootton Major. And it was published amazingly in the magazine Red Book. I am not kidding. And it's a very simple story in some ways. It's about this man's travels into the realm of Faerie. And there he encounters this figure, the Queen of Faerie. And it's just this beautiful, numinous encounter with her where it's one of the most kind of transcendent spiritual experiences that Tolkien conveys in his writing. And when you meet her, the Queen of Faerie, there really is this sense that the Queen of Faerie is in some ways parallel to what Jung calls the anima, but more than the personified soul of one man, she is the soul of the world. She's the anima mundi in all her glory. And in that way, she is Sophia. She is the goddess of wisdom, and she has thousands of names. And I really believe that she is the one who granted Jung and Tolkien permission to enter into this realm, and that much of the work that we are doing when we talk, answering Connie's question, for example, of traversing back and forth between realms and affirming that this is real, which is something that somehow the Western intellectual tradition has forgotten is our human birthright, that we are kind of facilitating this return of the Queen from this other realm back to this realm. So absolutely, she is the kind of crowning glory of the parallels between the two of them. And near the end of Jung's Red Book, we meet her as Salome, we meet her as the serpent sometimes even, and as just the soul as she's named with a capital S, but she also comes forward as this kind of celestial goddess queen near the end of the 7 Sermons to the Dead. And she reminds me so much of Elbereth Gilthoniel and Tolkien there. So that I hope answers the first question. The second, I love and affirm what you brought forward around how Tolkien speaks to diversity within his world of Middle-earth, which when we encounter the different peoples of Middle-earth, the elves, the dwarves, and not just the elves, there are many types of elves, and there are multiple families of dwarves and multiple, 3 branches of hobbits, and the many human beings and so on, and how much we can see their cultures reflected in so many ways in who they are, but how it's grounded in the landscape. Whether you're meeting the elves in Lothlorien or the Ents in Fangorn, there's this beautiful kind of ecological connection as well, how culture emerges from ecology. And that the whole premise of the story is bringing together the free peoples of Middle-earth, as they're called, to fight against Sauron, who is called enslaver and colonizer, and that his one ring is one that wants to homogenize all of these cultures and erase their differences. And so I do see it as a very beautiful celebration of both diversity, but the capacity to come together to preserve that cultural difference. So I very much agree with your premise there. Yeah, thank you for those questions.
Thanks, everybody.
Really appreciate it.
We're now looking at 7 p.m. Oh, sorry, did I interrupt you, Boris? Okay, sorry about that. I'm just looking at the clock. I see we're coming to 7 p.m. And, this is always how it goes. It gets especially interesting as we run out of time. So pointing everybody again to that thread on the page where you can continue this conversation. But also one question we did not get to, and so I'll just present it as a teaser. If you want to, so Becca, we didn't even talk at all about archetypal astrology or any of your work there. We stayed focused on Tolkien and Jung, but I know that's one of your real centers of expertise. And I know that you have a keynote speech coming up for a conference, and we shared that below. And I just wonder, as you maybe give us some of your last remarks, if you have any final thoughts or any teases around archetypal astrology, and then from archetypal astrology and how it might relate. And from there, we'll pass it over to Dana. And so I just want to take the chance to say thank you to my good friends I haven't seen for a while who showed up for this particular event, Craig and Nando. Chris, it's great to see you. I'm glad you're joining us again, but I haven't seen Craig for a while or Nando for a while. So thank you both for being with us. And with that, yeah, Becca, any thoughts you have about archetypal astrology and these red books? And for anybody watching, check out the link to see her keynote speech.
Thank you, Will, and thank you everyone for your amazing questions. And I've learned so much as well. So this has just been really rich and wonderful. There's so much that could be said about archetypal astrology, but I would credit it learning the archetypal perspective, which has very kind of deep lineage that runs through Jung, but back all the way to Plato and beyond to the mythic pantheons the world over. But I would credit that with being able to recognize the archetypal within the particulars. And I think that I did need that kind of seeing to be able to perceive a lot of the parallels between Jung's and Tolkien's Red books. But what I also appreciated about this study was, as I was saying to Dana, getting to focus more on the particulars while holding the archetypal in mind. But as a practicing archetypal astrologer, I think what it really allows us to see is, in some ways, the mythic narratives of our own time, and how when we talk about recognizing myth within the world around us or within our psyche, that it's not just isolated to our individual psyches, the internal sphere, or just this earthly realm, but rather drawing on Jung's idea of synchronicity. There is this perpetual synchronicity unfolding between the movements of the planets and what is unfolding here on Earth, in a way that cannot be explained by any kind of physical causal mechanism, but we must turn to something like Jung articulated with synchronicity, and to understand how there are these connections between the movements of the planets and our human and earthly events. And so it can be a very valuable perspective in making sense of what is happening, not just in our own individual lives, but collectively. And we've certainly all been through quite an extraordinary period, particularly this last year. And amazingly, astrology is one of the few perspectives that can offer us some kind of an understanding of when this might end, when the energies will change, and also looking back through history to see times that humanity has been through such trials before.
Becca, thank you so very much for an engaging evening. This has just been not only a wonderful talk, but I love when a little bit of conversation would come your way, like something would catch spark and then it catches fire. And you have a gift in terms of your ability to respond to something and blow it up so that we can see it and understand it. And that's a true gift. As Forrest said, your ability to handle the Q&A really elevates your gift, and we are the recipients. At this time, it's always unpleasant to kind of go back into the world after a magical evening, because basically it's the world we live in. We have one, and then we have many. And when we're by ourselves after this, we reflect back upon the magic that has come down our path. And we're among the people who are going forth. Not everyone, and I bring it back to the coronavirus, not everyone gets to go forth. And there are those that didn't make the journey all the way. So I would like to have another moment of silence as we go out of here. And thank you, Becca, for just a really magical evening. Thank you very much. Thank you, panelists. I appreciate every one of you, those who come every week, those who are new here for the first time. Nando, it's nice to meet you. Becca, of course, I'd love to have you back again sometime. If we can figure out a way to participate with one another. Chris, great to see you. And wow, Craig, it's been a while. Love you, man. Boris, Simon, peace, everyone.
Good to see everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you for the invitation, and this is just illuminating.